Brains in Motion with Mary McKone, EdD and Angela Zielinski, DPT. Please remember that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. This is not medical advice, and this is just general discussion for educational purposes. Thank you. Enjoy. Hi, Mary. Welcome back for episode 4. Today is reflexes and emotional and behavior regulation. Whew.
Woo.
A big topic. An important topic, but a big topic. So Mary, I liked how our last episode we kind of went through it piece by piece. So I'm going to start you off by asking, what is emotional and behavior regulation?
Absolutely. Well, emotional and behavioral regulation are skills that enable a child to recognize their own feelings and actions, adjust them when needed, and then use that to meet all the demands of their lives at home and school and their relationships, and to be flexible in that. So emotional regulation really is about recognizing, understanding, and managing emotions in ways that are appropriate or like fit the situation, rather than, being on the roller coaster of emotions and being kind of swept away. I guess that's a mixed metaphor. My English teacher background just went crazy when I said that, but you can't get swept away on a roller coaster, I guess, unless there's a tsunami, but you know what I mean. um, Getting, kind of swept away by whatever emotion hits them. Um, and it draws on all kinds of skills like attention and language and planning and effortful control in order to do that. So when we're having big emotions, that we have the ability to regulate them and then to control our actions. Whereas behavioral self-regulation is both the deliberate and not deliberate control of actions, and how we respond to those big emotions or to a situation. And that may play on or draw from attention and working memory and inhibition to follow rules and to wait, have good transition times, and then persist with tasks. And they're very intertwined. So both emotional and behavioral regulation gradually move from, caregiver led, right? A toddler has very little emotional regulation, and they constantly look to mom or caregiver for co-regulation. Like they're upset, they run to mom, mom gives them a hug, or in my case, grandma gives them a hug, and they calm down, and then they can manage their behavior again. So gradually over time, that goes from being caregiver led to them having their own ability to regulate those emotions and behaviors.
Wow. Yeah. And to me, I think of it as emotional regulation is what you're feeling on the inside. And then behavior regulation is how it shows up on the outside.
That is a great, great differentiation. Yes.
And those are both hard because, like you said, they're so linked that, like, if I'm feeling sad on the inside, on the outside I might cry, or on the outside I might run away, or I might go seek a hug. And those pieces can be difficult because sometimes we see the behavior, but we don't know what the emotional piece is. So we're not quite sure how to help or differentiate those things to kind of sort it out.
Yes. And sometimes behavioral regulation gets hijacked by our autonomic nervous system or our sensory processing system, which then triggers that sympathetic state. So it doesn't always have to be emotion based, but for a lot of the kids that you and I work with, their sensory processing is so impacted that a sound may be too loud or a visual stimulus may be overwhelming. The the brain perceives that as a threat. Now our vagus nerve fires off and we're in sympathetic, and then we have a behavior as a result of that. So it's not always emotion first and then behavior. Sometimes it's sensory first and then behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes it difficult sometimes because it's all intertwined and so linked. And as a
Mm-hmm.
parent or a caregiver, or when you're trying to figure out how do I help or how do we co-regulate, sometimes it helps to know the reason, and sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes you're just gonna give them a hug or do deep breathing with them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that made me think of the analogy I like to use when you were talking about like the sensory processing and the autonomic nervous system is I think of it as like we are a cup, and if you are already overflowing because
Yes.
you have a lot of processing challenges, and so I'm working really hard and then one thing just pushes me over the edge and I just overflow, and reflex integration can help lower that threshold in the cup is how I think of it.
That's great. I use a very similar analogy. It's just that the threshold is like the edge of a cliff,
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
right. So when we have all of these things that are overstimulating us, and we don't have enough like infrastructure in our nervous system to handle us, we keep getting pushed closer and closer to the edge of the cliff. And for a lot of kids, that threshold is right on the edge of the cliff. So
Mm-hmm.
all it takes is a tap, and then they're like, "Wow, we're free falling," and there's nothing to catch us because we've been tipped over, and we don't have the inhibitory messaging coming out of that left hemisphere to be like, "It's okay, you can come back." We're just in a free fall at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And emotional regulation and behavior regulation is very typical. It's part of our normal development. When you are younger, that's when everything is coming online. And so like an example Mary has here is um it's time to leave the park to go home, but the 3-year-old wants to keep playing. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have a nervous system that's firing correctly, maybe there's like a no, I don't wanna, and it lasts 30 seconds. And then the parent is able to redirect and you get to leave the park.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are a 3-year-old with a nervous system who is overloaded because you're outside and you've been moving and your shirt is too hot and you're sweating and you don't quite know how to process this information, and the parent goes, it's time to go home, that 3-year-old might take 5 minutes of a tantrum and need extra help to leave the park.
Or an hour.
Or an hour.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, some of the kids, when they come to me, they're having 5 or 6, 45-minute tantrums a day. It's the whole day is this giant roller coaster or falling off the cliff. So let's kind of talk about a little bit about why they're so important.
So emotional regulation and behavior regulation is important because that's how you can participate in life. If I'm
Yes.
crying, and from personal experience, if I'm crying all the time, it is hard to participate in life. It is hard to be a therapist. It's hard to connect with patients and kids if I am struggling with my day. But Mary, tell me more of why it's more
Okay.
important.
Sure. Um, so in everyday home life, self-regulation helps children to cope with frustrations and transitions and follow routines and recover from setbacks. And rather than kind of living in the cycle of tantrums or shutdowns, like I mentioned a minute ago, and better regulation is linked to fewer externalizing behaviors like aggression, defiance, and chronic noncompliance, which we see in PDA autism, which is, I I would say, 1 out of every 6 requests I'm getting from parents now is for PDA autism. So basically, everything you want the child to do, they're like, nope, nope. Anything, whether that's getting in the car, and I'm saying no, but that may be a, a full out tantrum or aggression, but anything that wasn't the child's direct choice is met with no. That could be school avoidance. It could be going to the park if today they don't want to go to the park, but yesterday they did go to the park. It might be wearing a particular piece of clothing, but it it's I mean, it impacts life so deeply for families, not being able to go out to eat or do things as a family out because one member of the family is like, no, everything has to be their way. Which for me, having studied polyvagal theory, that is a form of control for safety. The brain
Yes.
feels unsafe. And so when we go into protection and dorsovagal, it's about how do I control the environment so the environment can't hurt me? I will create routines and choices that I know are safe. And in that moment, it might have been safe yesterday, but it's not safe today. Because why? Who knows? It's a giant question mark. But in that particular moment, it was a no. And so I will withdraw and protect myself. And then it looks like this PDA approach to life. It's so overwhelming for families. Seeing really good improvement in those behaviors, though. So my message there is there's definitely hope for that.
It makes me think of with the PDA piece, and when you're talking about safety, one of the things with MNRI, and I think of Pamela Curley, one of the co-founders of MNRI. She talks a lot about flexibility and how you have to be flexible, and how MNRI and reflex integration, like a flexible spine means a flexible mind. And how that can help with these moments of needing to withdraw. If you have more flexibility, you can have less demand avoidance because you're able to interpret the information a little bit easier.
Resilience, right? Like there's something that happens and I may not really like that, but I'm resilient and I can bounce back from it. And my nervous system can be like, I don't really want to do that, but I'll go along with the program. That would be called every meeting I ever had to sit through as a teacher.
I like that.
And if there's teachers listening, they're like, yeah, oh, good. We have staff training today. I'll go, but I won't like
it. I mean, that's a lot of us. And so,
right? Yeah.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we talked about home life. So let's talk about school a little bit. So I mentioned teachers. So in school, behavioral regulation is king, right? I mean, the number one reason why school staff will contact parents is because of behavior. And behavior in schools is often really misunderstood and misread because behavior is, as you mentioned, always tells you something.
Yes.
So in school, behavioral regulation supports, sustained attention and attention shifting. Like I can listen to the teacher and then focus on my work, and then I can shift my attention to getting ready for recess and then shift my attention to coming back in from recess, following instructions, inhibiting impulsive responses. Like somebody next to me said something I didn't like, and my impulse is to hit them because I didn't like what they said. But behavioral regulation says that's not a good idea. You should just keep doing your work. So children who can manage their emotions and behavior tend to have better on-task behavior, have fewer disruptions, and thus have greater academic progress over time because they're able to regulate their bodies and their emotions so that they have better attention and they're taking more information in.
Wow, that's a lot. Kids have to do a lot. And then on top of these academic pieces, there's also the social piece of school too, of how are you interacting with your peers, like you said, like how are you taking in information from other kids depending on how regulated they are. That's such an interesting interaction, and cooperation and sharing and being able to do all of this while, I like how you said, while shifting attention.
Yeah, right. And this idea of social relationships and thinking about all of the interactions that kids have on a daily basis at school, like playgrounds are, and older kids, PE in the locker rooms is like a big point of where conflicts happen. In the social relationship, things happen, right? I mean, there's going to
Mm-hmm.
be disagreements and conflict, and even in play, sometimes kids are playing and the ball gets thrown too hard and then there's hurt feelings. And can they repair that? Can they regulate their emotions enough to repair that? Or does one kid, fly off the handle, so to speak, and then they're escalated and hitting or yelling or running away or crying or any of those things? So it becomes really hard to cooperate and share and negotiate relationships if you don't have that self-regulation. And what often happens to kids, I'm sure you've seen, I certainly saw as a school administrator, is certain kids then get isolated because the other kids are almost afraid to interact with them
Mm-hmm.
because they're perceived to be volatile.
Mm-hmm.
They're not sure
Yeah.
what to expect from them. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then that just makes the situation worse and worse and worse, because the kid who's being isolated really wants the social contact, and now they're feeling isolated and anxious and angry, and then we get kind of stuck in that loop.
Yeah. You're right. And those pieces are all tied to emotional regulation and behavior. And I think of multiple things. We're going to transition to how reflexes help with that, but it also makes me think of um like uh demonstrating or modeling behavior when you're younger.
Mm-hmm.
And so you mentioned play, about how it's good to have unstructured play. And then if something happens, to model how to repair those interactions or to help kids so that way when they're older, they have those skills. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a practice to me. So part of emotional regulation and behavior regulation is practice and modeling and co-regulation from
Mm-hmm.
parents or
Yes.
caregivers or aunts or uncles or just
Right.
adult interactions that are positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
But how do primitive reflexes play a role in all of this?
Would you like to speak on this one first?
No, I like it when you talk, Mary.
All right, let me put on my teacher hat here. Okay, so primitive reflexes and postural reflexes, certainly not just primitive, um, are increasingly discussed as a marker of like an incomplete maturation of the brain stem.
Hmm.
Okay, so reflexes, when they're primitive, the ones we're born with that are active when we're born, that is primarily a cerebellum, or a cerebellar is the adjective form of that, and brainstem function. So um, when we have retained reflexes, we don't have strong connections between the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the higher parts of the brain. So it's a brainstem cortical connection, right? So the cortices are up here at the higher parts of the brain, like the neocortex is often what it's referred to, and then the prefrontal cortex. So there's a weak connection there. So there's not good communication. So the frontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, are the regions that are normally responsible, particularly left hemisphere, so for suppressing or inhibiting these reflexes and supporting executive control. So if the prefrontal cortex is busy um, kind of holding down these reflex driven responses, then
Mm-hmm.
it has less energy, time, space, availability to manage uh, emotion and behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think we mentioned last time about, or in the sensory podcast, about the importance of the vestibular system.
Mm-hmm.
And the vestibular system is also really involved in attention or activating the prefrontal cortex, because when the vestibular neurons recognize that there's a change in posture, it activates the PFC like, hey, something's changing. I need you to pay attention. We might need some motor planning for us to adjust our body out of this. So please wake up. So if we have an underdeveloped vestibular system and we're not getting that communication, then we have less activity in the prefrontal cortex and thus less inhibition of these impulses, both emotional and behavioral. Everything is tied together. And I know we keep saying that, but because it's true, but it's true.
Yeah,
And
drinks.
I'm currently drinking a Diet Coke, or I would say, Jinx, you owe me a Coke, but it's currently on my desk right now. So I bring that up because I want people to recognize that it's a very complex system that we live in. And it's easy to look at a kiddo and say, oh, well, their behavior's out of control. But why? Why is their behavior out of control? There's always a reason underneath that. So we talked a little bit about primitive reflexes and then postural reflexes and core stability that comes from those postural reflexes. If those are weak, if we still have postural reflexes like, say, Landau and TLR and 18R and STNR that are active, and we have kids who they're putting in all this effort just to keep themselves upright, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all day long in school, their brain is working overtime just to keep their little bodies in those seats and not get up and move around and not fall out of their chair. And so when that happens, there's a baseline arousal that makes self-control more fragile, because the brain's like, oh, I've got to protect you. You're not safe because I'm having to put all this energy to keep you upright and make sure you're doing everything you need to do and listen to the teacher and look at what's on the board. And that's a lot of effort. So our level of arousal goes into high alert. Like, we're in a sympathetic state in our nervous system, which our listeners probably know is fight or flight. So we have so many kids that are just sitting in class and they're always in sympathetic because their brains are like, this is so much work to do this, and I've got to put all this effort in. And so then when something happens, like we said, we have no threshold. Like, we're always at the edge there, right? So then we also don't have cognitive capacity for things like problem solving and flexible thinking and social, like, perspective taking. You know, when you sit with the kid and you're like, well, how do you think Johnny was feeling? And Sarah's like, I don't care how Johnny was feeling. He took my pencil, right? I mean, there's just no room for that, right?
Yeah. When you were talking about all the systems firing at once, it's a level of fatigue. Your system is getting tired. And I think about when I'm tired, my filter is very slim. If you've ever met me and I'm tired, I'm going to tell you how it is. But if I'm well rested, I'm going to be very kind and I can regulate very nicely. But if I don't get sleep the night before, it is harder for me as a human being. And I think about that as kids with school. You might start off the day well regulated. I've got a good breakfast. I have had food. I've had a good night's sleep. But then by the end of the day, like we talked about before, is like that after school restraint collapse of, I just can't keep it together anymore because I'm tired and I've been holding it together all day.
Yeah, I was talking to a parent the other day. You know, I've lots of back issues going on, degeneration in my spine, and a lot of it's in the thoracic region. So it's affected my postural control. And so there are days that I feel how tired my brain is from just keeping my body upright. So I've created a whole little world where I can manage that, but I'm not in school for 8 hours a day, right? So I'm not being asked to do all these things by people. I get to control my own environment. So I think about that a lot with kids who have these postural issues and how exhausting it is for them just to get through the day. And then there's no bandwidth for them to manage their emotions when they get these big emotions, or they're feeling frustrated, or they're just being asked to learn something new, which is risk. And there is a bit of fear when you're being asked to do something new. And then if you also have challenges with learning, like say it's time for reading groups and I'm struggling with reading and I'm going to have anxiety going into that, I'm already set up to have emotional regulation problems because I'm asked to learn something that's really hard for me and I just don't have the bandwidth to regulate those emotions.
Oof.
I
It
know,
gives us a
right?
lot
That
of
makes me tired thinking about it for those little guys.
yeah, and it gives us a lot of empathy for them. And it helps us because we know that reflex integration, if you can make those pathways function easier,
Mm-hmm.
then school becomes easier. I
Yes.
talk a lot about with parents. I think of it as if I can organize my insides, then I can organize the outside. But I can't
Right.
organize outside of me or my external environment until my inside is more
Mm-hmm.
organized.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny you say that. I was talking to a parent today and they said, you know what's interesting? My kiddo likes kind of organized chaos, but this weekend, she actually kind of organized her room,
Yeah,
right?
that's so interesting. Yeah.
And I was like, how interesting. Um, so what that tells me is exactly what you said is like her internal mechanisms are getting organized. And now she's like, oh, I'm organized. I can organize other things too. Yeah. How
That's cool.
interesting. It is
That
cool.
is.
Yeah.
There's, as we've talked about, there are so many reflexes at play for all of these things. But if you if you have a couple specific examples, I can think of a couple different examples of
Mm-hmm.
reflexes at play that tie into emotional regulation and this learning piece. What comes to mind for you first?
Probably ones that people wouldn't necessarily think of.
Hmm.
I would probably start with Palmer and Plantar. Uh,
Okay.
Dr. Muskatova calls it Robinson, but hand grasp and foot grasp, because they are the two of the earliest reflexes. They're sensory reflexes, um, meaning that they have deep connections to our sensory system. So hands, mouth, and feet are very tied together, and it's the way a baby experiences the world. Even if you think about primates, you know, their hands and feet, they have the same grasp, but there's so much emotion tied to those reflexes that I think we mentioned this in the sensory podcast, but
Mm-hmm.
we use this verbiage in our language that when somebody's having a hard time, we tell them, you know what, just hold on.
Mm-hmm.
You're almost there. Or if somebody's getting out of hand, we'll be like, get a grip, man. Right. And if we're feeling unstable, we'll say we're on shaky ground or we're on solid ground,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of know instinctively that our hands and feet have something to do with security and being grounded, our feet particularly being grounded. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, babies grasp onto mom and hold while they're nursing, or when you're holding them, they'll hold on to mom. And so this idea of grasping and holding and being grounded are so vital for the development of the nervous system and the sensory system and the emotional component of that. hmm
Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing you mentioned before we got online is that there is an emotional component to every reflex. And these two are a really good example of that. We could talk about it more later, but there are deep, deep emotions in hands, mouth, and feet reflexes
Mm-hmm.
because, like, mouth reflexes, so like the other one I thought of right away was Babkin. It's like if you touch the full name is Babkin palmamento, but if you push into the center of a baby's hand, their mouth will open. And babies often do that. Like, you can stimulate a baby to nurse, actually. If you push into their hand, their mouth will open and then brooding reflex will get involved. Um, but that hand and mouth connection is there's so much emotion involved in there because it has about to do with nurturance,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, and Babkin, I think of when we talk about emotional regulation and behavior regulation, Babkin is also linked to our smooth muscle, and so if you experiment with it, I remember one class they had us do Babkin and then do our heart rate before and after, and our breath
Oh,
rate before and after Babkin. Yeah,
oh.
100% of people in class before like we did it, and we 100% of the people in the class after Babkin had a decreased heart rate and a decreased breath rate, but not because it's not, sounds worse, but it's because you were breathing deeper.
Yes.
So you had a less breaths per minute because you were taking in more and you were more regulated. Um, so that's what I think of with Babkin, of how that can be. And when you're younger and you're growing up, I feel like a lot of behavior shows up in hands and feet. Am I
Yes.
hitting?
Kicking.
Am I running away to get away from this scenario?
Mm-hmm.
And so hands and feet are so tied to emotions as well as how it shows up externally.
So the behaviors. Yeah.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's another reflex you might uh, automatically think of for emotional and behavior?
I think a lot about Gallant. Part of it is because I think it shows up a lot for kids in school, because what if my Gallant is too high and I keep touching the back of my chair? I'm going to wiggle. I feel threatened and I'm constantly twitching. And what does that show up as? A kid who can't sit still. So then the
Mm-hmm.
teacher says, "Hey, you got to sit still." And you're like, "Oh, I'm trying." Like, you don't
Mm-hmm.
understand that you're moving. You might not even realize it. And so the threat level gets higher. The threat level gets
Mm-hmm.
higher. Gallant's also a posture reflex. And so are you fatiguing? And it's
Mm-hmm.
also one of those flexibility reflexes of the
Mm-hmm.
spine of, do I have to stay rigid, or can I move in and out of this
Mm-hmm.
scenario emotionally, physically?
Mm-hmm.
So Gallant, and I know Gallant is also linked to the auditory processing system.
And the vestibular system, because the vestibular spinal tract runs directly under those muscles associated with Gallant. Yeah.
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 So I think of Gallant a lot. I
Mm.
think I have found Gallant helps a lot with sleep. Because if you've got blankets or you've got loose fitting pajamas, that might bother you, or you might wake up multiple times if that's not integrated. Um, and so to me, Gallant is a big emotional and behavioral
Mm.
one that I see a lot. And because it's so important for infants, for like rolling and sitting up and like segmental movement, I try to help that one, because I know later in life, if it's not integrated, you are going to be challenged, especially in a school setting.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Before we got on, I shared a story with you about Bower crawling.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, it's such for our listeners. But before we got on, we were talking about the emotional component of reflexes and kind of how we wanted to talk about that. And I shared this story with her. It's deeply personal, but I'm glad to share it because I think it's a good example of how we store memories in our body even when we don't have the language or the ability to recall them cognitively,
hmm
consciously, that they still stick with us. And for most of the kids I work with, there was a lot of trauma at birth or
hmm
even pre-birth. And those memories get stored and can be attached to movement patterns. So I'll tell you this story. So when I was 9 months old, I was adopted, by the way, twice. I feel like that's probably an important part of the story. So both before I was 3 months of age. So I was adopted twice by the time I was 3 months of age. So obviously some, abandonment and stuff going on there. So at 9 months of age, my adoptive mother was pushing me out of the store in a grocery cart. and a car speeds up. It was a Gemco, if anybody's 50 or older, by the way, if anybody remembers Gemcos. Um, and this car comes speeding up and hits the cart. It was purposeful. It was a revenge for my father turning in a drug ring on his postal route. He was a mailman, and with the intention of killing me. They weren't successful, obviously. But I was thrown out of the cart and ended up in the hospital for several months. Spleen damage and some broken ribs and stuff. And um, my father told me for years, there was a story in my family that the nurses said I kept trying to entertain the geriatric people because peds was down the hall from geriatrics. So I would get out of the crib. This is before they had standardized cribs that babies couldn't get out of. And they'd find me down the hall. And so the way that they fixed that is they put me like in one of those old tents. If you've ever seen old photos of pediatric wards, they would put these tents around the cribs to keep babies in. And I guess even from a baby, I was like, nobody can put baby in a quarter. I was like, oh no, I got to get out of here. So let's fast forward about till I'm about 45. I'm at an MRI training and we're working on Bauer crawling. And for the life of me, I cannot make my legs do that. That's belly crawling or commando crawling for our listeners. I could not make my legs do that. And I knew that I had done that as a baby. I'd met all my milestones actually ahead of time, which is a different topic for a different day. But yeah, I could not. And the well-meaning person who was working with me, we probably worked on it longer than I should have. And I ended up in tears. And finally, the trainer came over and was like, yeah, we've got to call this a day. So she covered me with a blanket. I literally fell asleep on the table while they continued class. And it was near the end of the day. Well, that night, I had the wildest, craziest dreams ever. And they were so real. But I was an infant in that crib with the tent around it. And I was trying to get out of the crib and I was trying to crawl and I could not get my legs under me. And I was screaming and crying in the dream. And I could feel how hot I was. I could feel the sweat. I could feel the angst. And I woke up in a dead sweat. I mean, I was drenched and my heart was racing. And I woke up and I was like, oh my Lord, what was that? And then I went to class the next day and I was like, okay, I don't know if this is appropriate, but I need to tell somebody what happened last night. And so I explained what happened. She's like, oh, we brought up a memory in your subconscious that happened in your pre-verbal stage. And sometimes working on these reflexes can bring up those emotions.
Oh, it is so true.
After that, though, there was such a huge emotional release because I didn't know as a 45-year-old woman that I had been holding on to this my entire life. Yeah. And finally, it was brought into my consciousness. So then I could let it go. Crazy.
And could you tell a difference once you let it go internally?
Yes, because when we talked about being at the edge of the cliff, that is how I spent about 40 years of my life.
Yeah.
And when I came back from that training, I had about 6 feet away from that cliff.
Isn't that a nice feeling?
It is a remarkable feeling. And the more reflex work I did, like I'm a mile away from that cliff now. But just to have that space be given to me was a remarkable experience. But I thought it was important to share that because as practitioners or as parents, sometimes you work on these reflexes and you can stir up these emotional things. And Angela, I know you talked a little bit about before we got on about that. Maybe you want to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, what we were talking about before is I was telling Mary I was a little bit nervous about this topic because I wish somebody would have warned me that reflexes hold multiple layers and that they are so tied to our emotions, because the experience that Mary had, I've had similar experiences myself, but before I had them in myself, I would see it in kids and it would show up as we're working on rolling. And then all of a sudden, a child would just start crying and have this meltdown. And the first couple times it happens, I didn't know what was going on. And like I'm a kind person, so I could hold this space and we would regulate together and we would work through it. But I didn't understand how rolling and this reflex integration work was bringing up such large emotions, and nobody was like, hey, just so you know, you're working on multiple parts of a system. Here's how you can help re-regulate or have calming strategies. Like Mary was saying, she has a list of calming strategies and how to stay present and to look for treatment responses, um, because it's so important. But like Mary said, it creates space.
Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, I didn't realize how much I was holding until I took a stress hormones class. And the way I describe it to people was I had this internal edge that I didn't know I had until it was gone.
Right.
Yeah, so when you
Right.
said you're like a mile away from the cliff, my question is like, Mary, did you even know you were at the edge of the cliff?
Yes, I did
Oh,
actually.
okay. That's I
Yeah.
I didn't. I didn't realize how full my cup was until I got some space.
Well, let me remember at that time I was a high school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 35 kids at a time, 175 kids a day that were constantly pushing my buttons.
Okay, so yes, you were at the very
and uh, but I didn't know anything about, like if I had read The Body Keeps the Score back then, I
yes.
like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't, and polyvagal theory wasn't really widely available, or yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Or my grandmother's hands is another good one.
well, we should probably chat a little bit about Moro and fear paralysis.
Oh, Mary, would you like to broach that subject? Please.
Sure would. Um,
Tell me how Moro and fear paralysis help us with emotional regulation and behavior regulation, Mary.
sure. Okay. So I mentioned this before. I know there's a lot of practitioners out there that are going to say I'm wrong, and it's okay. That's fine. But Moro and fear paralysis are not developmental reflexes. They do not create the same neural connections that Babinski, spinal galant, Bower crawling, Landau, all of those do. They are responses of our autonomic nervous system. So if you, as an infant, every sensory input except mom's voice and mom's touch and mom's face is a threat to survival. So what do babies do? They go into the Moro startle, right? Whoop, whoop. And then the other side of that is curling up into fetal position for protection. So in an infant, the Moro's response is to protect them and keep them alive. Help! I need help. Mom, caregiver, help! I'm wet, cold, tired. That was loud. What is that? Please pick me up. That's the response. And then fear paralysis really emerges very young in utero, very early, and it's a withdrawal response. So if there's a loud noise outside the uterus, or there's a sudden jarring, or the fetus will actually withdraw into a ball for protection. So in polyvagal theory, fear paralysis is like the dorsal vagal response, the like reptilian brain response to stressors. Like, go ahead.
Say to freeze.
Well, like in polyvagal theory, fight, flight, freeze is like sympathetic, but when you go into this deep protection where you're withdrawing and you kind of lose access to your language centers and you have very high level anxiety, you often have very shallow breathing. I call it like the great armadillo. Like you go into this, like, I'm going to put a protective mechanism over myself. You can't see me. You can't hear me. I'm safe. I'm not even here. Don't even worry about it. That's how I think of dorsal vagal and fear paralysis. Is I'm paralyzed with my fear, literally, of what might happen. Proprioception gets completely shut offline because my brain doesn't want to feel what might possibly happen. So I can't even feel anything. So, um, in polyvagal theory, we're supposed to have a fluid autonomic nervous system. We're supposed to be able to move in and out of various states so that we can adapt to whatever environment has in store for us. So um, we might be excited about something, so we're in sympathetic, but it's positive. It's not negative. It's not about survival. It's I'm really excited, or I'm playing a competitive game and I need to like rally the troops to be competitive. But it also has that protection, that survival aspect. Think of Moro, um, sympathetic as survival, and then dorsal as protection. Is kind of how I look at it. Like fight or flight is about survival, fear paralysis is about protection. So really, when we see kids that are in one of those two states, it's not that Moro is causing it. It's that whatever is going on in the nervous system that the brain says, oh, you're not safe. That's what we're seeing. It's a manifestation of the nervous system. It is a completely different way of looking at those, and I understand that.
It's interesting.
But as a practitioner, me personally, I don't work directly on Moro. I work on the things that could make the brain feel unsafe: sensory processing through sensory reflexes, vestibular function, postural reflexes, and when those get addressed, the Moro response, fight or flight, disappears on its own. Disappears.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Now, I will say that in the case that I have a kid who's in freeze, I mean, like deep freeze, like they're in fear paralysis, I do address that directly first. Because when you're in a state of protection, the brain will not change. It just refuses. Because that means that we might have to come out of protection, and the brain doesn't know that that's safe. So how do you do that? Lots of proprioceptive work, like I do neurotactile, a bracing squeeze, a lot of tapping, some gentle rocking from RMT. And it just like lets go. It just let go. And then once you're out of this deep protection of dorsal vagal, then you can be like, okay, brain, maybe there's another way for you to show up in the world. Maybe your vagus nerve doesn't have to be going crazy all the time, that life is dangerous. Maybe there's an alternate path for you. So I put that out there because I think that there's a lot of folks out there that are like, oh, you have to do Moro fear paralysis first. If you don't address Moro, you won't go anywhere. And so people are doing like, meatball and cannonball for months and not seeing any benefit, because my question always is why? Why is Moro active? What is going on in the child's system that the brain thinks that it's not safe and has to be in this hyperactive, oversensitive state?
Yeah. It's a new way of thinking about it. I think it's interesting. I think I'm just going to be careful with what I say because I don't think I have as deep of understanding, or I might have a different understanding of it. And sometimes I'm not able to articulate it. But what I've seen, what I just saw recently, which is interesting and brings it up as like that developmental piece, is I saw a baby using Startle and Moro for postural control. So when you say, right, when you say that what is happening, what proprioception, instead of head writing, she was startling. And it was on, and so that's an interesting piece of if you address head writing, if you address proprioception, if we address other things, she won't need to startle to maintain her posture.
So Moro does have that developmental response at birth But one could also argue that that is a function of the autonomic nervous system to take the first breath of life. I'm
Hmm.
just not sure that has been studied enough as the developmental piece, and it's still called a reflex, but maybe it would be better served if we called it a response.
Sure. Like, you know how you put your bucket of neural reflexes, it almost sounds like
Uh-huh.
it's an autonomic nervous system reflex versus
Yeah.
like a developmental reflex. And
Yeah.
um, Mary's
Yeah.
not saying it's not important. It's just a different way, a different
Mm-hmm.
lens. And like
Yeah.
we're always learning, right? And different
Mm-hmm.
practitioners have different opinions.
Yep.
And it's all just information, which is part of this podcast. And thank you, Mary, for being willing to just broach the subject. I was I was like, let's tread lightly. Um, but I think it's interesting and it's just a different way to look at things. I have also found in my own work that like the fear paralysis work, it might not be directly, sometimes I feel like it's called something in like MNRI or in Sonia Story's work, Move, Play, Thrive. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we use the word fear paralysis for certain techniques, but maybe it's addressing, we don't quite know what it is addressing or how it's addressing it. But I do know that those techniques have helped me with people
Mm-hmm.
to improve emotional regulation in terms of like bringing down anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
of being like the tapping tool to be able to regulate and be able to
Mm-hmm.
function when your nervous system is at a really high threat level. So,
Well, that was actually exactly what I thought of when you said we use things we may not be sure is facial tapping,
mm,
right? Is a
mm-hmm,
common one we use for FPR. Well, that is for a trigeminal nerve, and
mm,
the trigeminal nerve is connected to the vagus nerve,
mm. Lots of
right?
vagus nerve work in
Right?
MNRI. Yeah.
Well, and vagus nerve is what regulates our autonomic nervous system. So we tap the trigeminal nerve, our face relaxes because part of the physiological response to being in fight or flight or free or protection in dorsal is our facial muscles tighten down.
Mm,
Actually, our whole body tightens down, right? The core
mm-hmm,
tendon guard is part
yeah.
of our protective response. So when we tap and we release that, the trigeminal nerve tells the vagus nerve, like, you know what? It's okay. We're okay. We can. And then when we tap on the chest, it opens up our breathing. And again, vagus nerve. And we're like,
Mm-hmm,
oh, I can also breathe.
mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Let's move on, shall we?
Sure. Yeah. Uh, how does emotional regulation and behavior help us learn about the world? I think it helps us learn about the world because it actually allows us to connect with the world. If
Yes.
I'm not emotionally regulated or I'm not able to behave in a way that helps others be safe or helps others also feel regulated, I have a hard time connecting or being out in a social environment. And the world is a very social place, I have learned. So,
Yeah. So, what you were saying about having a hard time connecting in social relationships, it impacts empathy and perspective taking, right?
mm, hmm,
If I'm emotionally dysregulated, I certainly can't recognize somebody else's emotions, and I certainly can't demonstrate empathy for those emotions or understand their perspective in something. I think it affects our ability to understand social norms. Why are people acting like that? What are the rules of that interaction?
mm-hmm,
Because my nervous system is still reading everything as danger. And so I don't have the ability to like stop and recognize what's going on and kind of learn that behavior. hmm But thinking about older kids in school, if they don't have that ability to stop and recognize and empathize and understand because their system's on alert all the time, then it blocks us from establishing those kinds of deep, meaningful relationships. Um,
it also makes me think of, I feel like reflex integration helps a lot with mirroring or mimicking like
Absolutely.
movements which you're talking about, like being able to watch and then mimic. And that's actually a really hard skill because like apraxia can affect it. And if you aren't organized, you might watch and receptively be like, okay, I see what they're doing, but I don't know how to make my body do that.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
feel like that helps us interact and learn about the world too. If I can't reciprocate, it's hard for people to know that I'm responding or that I'm here. One of the last pieces I think that we wanted to talk about and address was this idea that co-regulation is important and
Yes.
how, as a practitioner, it's really important for us to be grounded and regulated and present to be able to help our clients be those things and to model that behavior and to hold the space for them. And in my case, it's I'm there in person, and in your case, you're teaching parents and caregivers how to do that.
Right.
And that there's so many pieces to emotional regulation, and reflexes are just a link to it.
Yes. And in the case of parents, particularly moms, babies and moms are connected forever. So some of our listeners may not know this, but when a woman is pregnant, mom and baby actually trade cells. They're called they're called chimerisms. So babies give cells to mom, mom gives cells to baby. And actually, in the case that mom is sick or injured, the baby can give stem cells to mom out of the cord to help them recover. I mean, it is remarkable. I read somewhere recently that some of those chimerisms actually end up in the heart tissue.
Wow.
So sometimes, as I have all adult children, and sometimes I'll just get this inkling that something isn't right with one of them. And they're all spread out. I mean, my son is 1,200 miles away, but I can feel a disturbance in the force when right, when things are, how is that possible? I don't know across the distance, but what I know is that we share each other's cells. And so moms and babies are eternally connected at a level that no other caregiver can match. So when mom is feeling dysregulated, when she's completely stressed out, when she's in sympathetic or protection, the child will also pick up on that and mirror that. So if you have a child who is sitting in a place of dysregulation, I know it can be very overstimulating for a parent to be in that all day long. I completely empathize and understand that. But I would like to suggest to you as a listener how important it is to take those moments throughout the day to help find your own center and to keep yourself regulated so that you can co-regulate your child and that they can mirror a nervous system that's in parasympathetic, that is in rest and digest.
Yeah, and it's completely normal and nobody is perfect that you are going to have moments of dysregulation.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
There's no expectation that, and there's repair and there is real life. So
right.
Yes, you are going to be in sympathetic, and it is hard and it is overstimulating, and it is also very helpful to your child if you can model and be regulated. So one of the things, so again, I just recently have taken our class, which is why it's so fresh, but Move, Play, Thrive. Sonia's story talks a lot about how she recommends parents do all of the exercises that she is teaching before you teach it to your child. And that how many parents have talked about if they wouldn't have done that first, that they wouldn't have been able to follow through as well as they follow through. So I think that that's doing emotional regulation and reflex work on yourself can be so beneficial for your child.
Mhm. So maybe we could end with just a couple of examples who have experienced improvement in their self-regulation from reflex work.
The one I think of that makes me smile is I worked with this set of twins. This mom was so kind, and I met them when they were about 4 months old. And they found me because one twin was regulated and sleeping well and a pretty chill baby. And the other one was having a really hard time. They were crying a lot. They were just uncomfortable. You could see that there was a difference in their nervous systems. And the mom found me by happenstance. And when I went, you could tell, yes, there is clearly a difference. And I did 30 minutes I did some fear paralysis work. I did some core tenon guard work, and I did feet. And I saw them again the next week. So 30 minutes because they were little, right? And 30, like, it was probably 15 minutes of real hands-on work and 15 minutes of snuggles and embrace and squeeze and just talking, right? But I came back the next week and mom was like, it's incredible. She slept. She hasn't been as agitated. She's been more social. And I can tell a noticeable difference in life. So that's the one I think of a lot.
That's amazing.
How about you?
Yeah, so my example, I just posted about this in my Facebook group, if any of you are on that group. So there's a 11-year-old boy, he's in another country, and every day they live in an apartment, and he would go out to the patio and he would jump and jump and jump like as hard as he could. Jump, 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 and his hands would be involved and yell. And up to 2 hours a day this was going on. And then at night he'd do the same thing in his bedroom. Just last week she told me that it stopped completely. Just completely stopped. And what have we been working on as of late? Hands, mouth, and feet. He's grounded. He knows where his body is in space. Now, we already did all the neurotactile proprioception. We've been working together about 8 months, I think. 8 months? 6 months? But I've really been focusing on this with him for the last few months. And this was the week. His brain was like, oh, cool. Thanks. I know where I am now. I don't need to pound my feet into the ground to know where I am and to yell, which creates vibration, right? So again, you can activate proprioception through yelling. And now his brain's just like, oh, that's great. I know where I am. I don't need that input anymore. And I mean, what a life changer that is for that kiddo, right?
Yeah. That's cool. I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good example, Mary. Very nice.
Yeah. Yours too. That's delightful.
The little infant twins. Here's my other PSA for twins. How about is the easiest way to help reflex integration with twins is that a lot of people will always put them on the same sides so that they know where they are. And so sometimes the twins will get a side preference because they're just always looking at each other. So make sure that you're rotated. Don't always put twins down in the exact same place, in the exact same spot, because you just kind of feed into on accident. Twins want to look at each other or touch each other. And so make sure that you are putting twins on different sides. Remember, it's a very simple, but it's something you naturally are going to do. This twin goes here and this twin goes there. So just make sure that you are giving them opportunities to look at each other on both sides.
Wonderful. Well, as always, another rousing conversation. So I hope our listeners found some value in our topic today.
Me too. Thank you, Mary. And thank you for being willing to broach new subjects and talk about reflexes in new ways. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much.
Always a pleasure. You're welcome.
You can email us at brainsinmotionpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Mary at her website, brain-works.org, or on Facebook with her Facebook Reflex Integration groups. If you would like that information, please check our show notes. And you can find Angela at angelapt.com or rainbowdragonbooks.com. Thanks for listening.